All right, please get seated. We'll get going here. Thanks for staying around. This is going to be a fantastic panel. And it's a mid-afternoon. You got some sugar. I know energy level might not be as high as you might want to have, but we are very privileged and honored to have this group of experts and leading thinkers in this space. Again, for those of you who just joined, I'm Shaowen Wang. I'm a professor of geography and geographic information science, and also NCSS staff, directing this new campus Center for Advanced Digital and Spatial Studies. Welcome you back. Thanks for your participation this far. I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists. As I mentioned, this group of experts really do not need much introduction with today's technologies, and their names just out there. But I'll go through very briefly who they are, and in your information packet, you have the agenda that includes several questions. We asked our panelists to think about their responses to one or more of those questions, and this would likely take half time of this panel session, and then we leave about 30 minutes left for open discussion between the audience and the panel. I'll try to stay away from the flow as much as I should be. But let me begin say thank you so much for all of you coming here to speak on the panel. We have, I'll go with the order sitting here closest to me. This is a law of geography. We go nearest first. Bob McMaster, one of my most respected mentors in the community, running to Bob all the time. He's now getting to the administration world, is associate provost of University of Minnesota. But what I know Bob for such a long time is a leading thinker in GI science and cartography, and his deep insights into scale in geospatial problem solving and representation of maps. I'll hold your applause until we get through all the panelists. So Bob, welcome you here. And Peter Ball from Harvard University. People might know Peter to be the one has this brainchild of Center for Geographic Analysis at Harvard, which is something geographers might get proud of. But actually, Peter is not a geographer. Peter is a historian. I picked up Peter last night at airport. The first few sentences he said to me was Chinese. So he's an expert of Chinese history as well. But Peter recently stepped up also as associate provost of Harvard. So we have two associate provosts sitting together with each other. I don't know whether that's a geography law or not. And you already heard Lynn talk earlier, and he's the director of Center of Excellence for Geographic Information, Geospatial Information Science. And I'm not going to spend more time on Lynn, just to move on to Xin Chen. Xin is a senior scientist of Nokia. Now they call themselves here. Which is a very interesting spatial term. And also he's a manager of here and an expert of computer vision. Just to give you a sense of breadth of the very dynamic and alive geospatial science and technology world. And the Bhaduri, of course, the distinguished speaker this morning, presenting to us a broad spectrum of excitement coming from the big data and associated analytics applied to urban and infrastructure problems. So that's my very quick 10-meter high-level introduction to our distinguished panelists. Let's give them applause for being here and apply to the law of spatial autocorrelation, but in a negative way. I will start with Budhu on the farthest for responding to the questions.
Thank you, Shaowen. I need to keep you around for these generous introductions every 2 hours. It feels great. I think this is a very exciting time in the world of GIS, especially because of what the cyber infrastructure enables the community to do. For those of you who heard me in the morning, my thought and passion of late has been going back to what I was trying to do in graduate school is translate science down to the masses for something more meaningful than infotainment. So we are all very familiar with the sort of the spatial applications that are have caught a lot of attention in society, because now you can find a cab much quicker on the street or find a good restaurant around us, and which are very important things, trust me. But in terms of domain, I fundamentally believe that the scientific domain that is really changing everything around us is this process of urbanization. And if you probably all understand that we are going to be living in a very urban world in not too far from now. I think 80% of the people are likely to live in what is currently known as urban areas in around 2050. And I've been fascinated with this process of how this process of urbanization, essentially, if there is one thing that we do as human beings that is fairly irreversible, that is pouring concrete and asphalt, which cannot be taken backwards. So once poured, you are going to be dealing with it forever, it seems. That's how the trend has always been. And there are these both kinds of challenges of understanding that dynamics, and I have lived and grown up in science, and what's happening in my environment, I can see it being driven by economic interests, but even somebody like me doesn't have the tools to go out there to a public meeting and convince people that the actions taken for creating a new apartment complex is essentially downstream, devastating and detrimental. I just don't have the data and the science and the tools to prove it, although I know that I can. So my philosophy has been that the potential for CyberGIS is really to make science as easy as the most elegant example of CyberGIS we have, which is navigation, which humanity has, or at least in the developed society, humanity has accepted as a default. Nobody thinks that they are doing enormous amount of science, whether it's geography or computer science or information science, when you flip out your smartphone and get directions. It's the value add that's it's driving, and that's how the rest of the science should be. So that's what my dream is, and I think CyberGIS is my only way I can think about. And Lynn was touching in his presentation about the enormous amount of data that's going to make these answers better, but how do you enable that for the users and to the masses? And I think that's a very, very key area of focus and area of potential, high potential. The other aspect that I think, especially every time I come to these academic campuses, CyberGIS is also changing the way we have looked at integrated and interdisciplinary research on academic campus. 15 years back when I was getting my PhD, I had to spend time in a completely different school of engineering. So I was in the School of Science. I had to go to the School of Engineering just to learn what GIS was, and take classes and learn and do these tools. And I can almost, that sounds like a ridiculous thing today. And it's only going to evolve, and this complex systems issues that we are all trying to ultimately solve for our society are only going to be addressed adequately when we bring this kind of interdisciplinary approach from the very beginning and not when you're just trying to solve problems. So I think that's very exciting. And I'm very excited that Shaowen has enabled this at Illinois. So I think that's good enough.
I should stop you. Thanks very much. Xin. For 5 minutes.
Sure. Okay.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, thank you for Shaowen giving me this opportunity to be here. If you are not familiar with here, we were actually formerly known as NAVTech, which is the global leader in digital mapping, traffic, and location-based service and content. So in addition to my full-time responsibilities at here, I also teach a geospatial vision and visualization course at Northwestern and the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. So CyberGIS is really near and dear to me. So today I'm going to share with you 3D mapping and CyberGIS from my own work experience and teaching experience. So first I'm going to just talk about the big geospatial data, and thanks to Lynn, he actually already covered almost all the data get involved in 3D mapping. Then I will provide some real applications that why 3D map is important in our life, right? What's the applications? And in the end, I will share with you my thoughts on the challenges and opportunities in CyberGIS for 3D mapping. So 3D mapping for us is the indexing of the real world. So not only we have accurate geometry, texture, color, but also we have rich semantic content. For example, three-dimensional cities, buildings, landmarks, road. So this is what we create. So to accomplish this, we need to collect multiple modalities of data that what Lynn presented before. So for example, street level imagery, LiDAR data, satellite imagery, aerial data, oblique view, orthogonal view, right? So all these data are geo-referenced, so it's huge. And so what why these are the 3D mapping are important? So I give you first one example is, for example, if you are familiar with intelligent transportation traffic analysis, traditionally we use zone information. For example, Urbana could be a zone, right? A county or a city. We use the demographic information like the employment rate, population to analyze this cost, demand, traffic flow information. But once we have detailed three-dimensional maps, 3D buildings, we know where the exit is, where the entrance is, we know the capacity of the building is, then we can overcome the drawback of the traditional approach that assume all the objects, all the trips are evenly distributed on the road links. So we know, also the POI information of the buildings, so we can have more accurate traffic analysis. Another example, the smart grid, right? So electrical vehicle charging stations, V2G and G2V. So once you have detailed information of the 3D building models, the capacities, the points of interest, the business hours, then you can more intelligently deploy these systems. The third example is what I'm currently working on. Probably most of you have heard about the news. A couple of automakers have announced that they will have autonomous vehicles for their high-end products by 2020. One of the most important components to enable autonomous driving is to have a highly detailed and updated three-dimensional lane-level roadmap, which is currently not available commercially. So in order to do that, we are using, for example, ground-level LiDAR data, right, instead of airborne. So we collect the 3D point cloud. Each point has its own lat-long elevation and has very precise accuracy, right? So we collect millions of points per second to get this detailed road. So later I can talk more if you're interested in this. So now I'm going to share my thoughts on the challenge and opportunities. Let's use this road modeling as an example. It's probably not a big deal to model this 3D city of Urbana or 3D city of Chicago, right? However, but if we want to scale, the scalability, I think is a big challenge. How do you scale up to the entire country, entire continent? Since we are a global digital map provider, right? And our customers are automotive industry. So my background is computer vision. So we have applied a lot of artificial intelligence technologies to automate the process. And also my personal experience that because the data is huge, so it's sometimes very slow. So with CyberGIS, cyber infrastructure, this can really speed up. On the other hand, like computer vision technologies, algorithms can also benefit from CyberGIS because there was always this time constraint when we design algorithms in computer vision. So I think big opportunities is to marry or integrate computer vision into CyberGIS, and I think there will be a lot fruitful result from this. Thank you.
Thanks, Xin. Lynn?
You heard what I said in the keynote, and I think I touched on a lot of the questions that are here. But just to focus specifically on a couple of these opportunities for CyberGIS, I think the real big opportunity is probably an integration and of course that's always been the strength of GIS from when it got started, was the ability to integrate various data types. What I see CyberGIS is really an extension of that capability to permit broader sets of integration of more different types of data. But more than just the data integration is the integration of different subject matter that we're starting to see. And many of the examples I think Shaowen has shown that they've done in the past have touched on lots of different topical areas and been able to integrate things. So I think that's one of the real big opportunities and strengths of CyberGIS is in the ability to extend current capabilities further into the integration of data and different subject matter. For the research questions, I'll give you an example of kind of where I think CyberGIS has some real potential to address research questions that we haven't thought about. And I'll do it by giving you an example from some work I did when I first started at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. At that time, the only available elevation data nationwide was 3 arc seconds, about 90 meters on the ground. I took the data for the state of Wisconsin that USGS had. They were in 1 degree by 1 degree cells. And I put all of those data together for the entire state. And I created shaded relief and stereo maps at a 1 to 500,000 scale and printed these things out. So you had a shaded relief image and then a 3-dimensional stereo image created from the elevation model. And I did this and showed it to Jim Knox, who was a geomorphology professor there at the time. And Jim had been doing research in the Driftless area of Wisconsin for over 20 years at that point in time. And he looked at those images, and immediately he could see things in the geomorphology that he had never been able to see before, because he had a holistic image of the entire state and the terrain the way that it looked. So just by having that one view that had pulled all of this together from some fairly detailed elevation data, he was able to make connections within the terrain between different parts of the geomorphologic landscape that he had never been able to make before. I see that as an example of what CyberGIS has the capability to do for us, to allow us to bring very large data sets together at very high resolution that we have never been able to use together before. So I think the potential to address questions and ask questions we haven't been able to ask before is opened up by the ability to handle these large data volumes at high resolution and being able to put them together in one environment. The last thing I'll touch on is some of the impediments to the implementation of CyberGIS. And I think the single largest impediment is one that we face inside USGS, and I mentioned that in the talk before, and that is our ability to transfer data across our networks. If we could move data fast enough across our networks between our servers, then we probably wouldn't have much difficulty implementing CyberGIS. So I think our network, the ability to move data is probably the single biggest impediment, at least for us, and I think for a lot of other organizations that would be potential users of CyberGIS.
The cyber infrastructure generally is
Well, that segue to Peter.
Yep.
You see-
So, as Wang Shaowen said, I'm an historian. I'm not a geographer. I'm certainly not a scientist, so I'm here for light relief to tell jokes, stuff like that. One of the things that happened when we set up the Center for Geographic Analysis at Harvard was that we were a GIS shop, basically, and so we don't do research. We support researchers who want to bring spatial analysis into their work. And since there was no Department of Geography, people had a very vague notion of what spatial analysis was and what GIS was. So we made a real effort to try to bring that into the curriculum, bring that into people's research. And I remember within the first half year of starting to work with people using GIS, basically using ArcGIS, people started to see these visualizations and they said, hey, I want that on the web. And we said, well, we don't do web design. We don't do that sort of stuff. We just do the GIS. And they said, no, you got to put it on the web. And so everything began to look like a one-off. You want your project up on the web and designed for you. And so we started to work on what's the platform that we could use, or how do we have a platform where people can share information and share data and collaborate and upload and download and so on. And that became WorldMap, which really exists because of the open source community that supports it, the open source GIS community. But that did get me into this whole issue of cyber infrastructure and thus cyber GIS. There's another point that I'd make as an historian, though, which I think is actually important to this, or 2 points as an historian. One is the word which I've heard used today a couple times is motion. Well, motion for me is time, right? Things take place in time. Something that was there a minute ago or a second ago and is over here a second later, that's time, right? And the integration of time and space is really, really hard to do that well and to do that fluidly. The other is a general historical reflection on the nature of the advancement of knowledge. At least from an historian's point of view, the advancement of knowledge has, certainly since the 19th century, has been very closely tied to specialization, which is why we have silos in academic departments. And there's a theory that was put forward that advances in knowledge came from paradigm shifts. This is the Thomas Kuhn theory of scientific revolutions. But there's another way of by the way, that's something that scientists really hate. They don't like this notion of paradigm shifts. But there's another way of thinking about advances of knowledge, which I think really applies to GIS. And that's the notion that advances of knowledge follow on the development of new tools. That the microscope, which allowed you to see things smaller than you could see, the telescope allowed you to see things very big but very far away that you couldn't see. That this was the moment at which you had truly fundamental shifts taking place in the nature of the way we thought about the world and thought about reality. And I'd like to suggest that GIS, in fact, is one of those tool events that is not fully recognized yet in the academic community as being a tool that has profound revolutionary significance. Now, Lynn has already mentioned one of the basic problems of the cyber infrastructure, which is that the heavier the load we want to carry, the wider the pipes need to be. And look, if we think about this for the whole world, it's even worse. Right? We're way behind where we could be. We're still, in many ways, a lot of the really interesting GIS stuff is still on a desktop and not online. And yet, cyber GIS is more accessible online, it's more convenient, more integrated solutions are possible, it's sometimes more scalable, we have access to more data sources, there's more collaboration. There are all sorts of reasons for CyberGIS, but there are also lots of challenges with this. If we see this as something that's going to be reaching a more general public, people who aren't scientists, who are not even citizen scientists, but users of various kinds, who start to see that the world they live in takes place not only through time, but through space. We're giving them a lot of systems to choose from, and they're changing quickly. So one of the great things about this field is that it keeps, many of you remember what it used to be, early days of GIS, what it was like to use this software then. Think of where we are now. But there's ArcGIS Online, there are other kinds of things one can do. There's WorldMap at Harvard. And so keeping up with it is a challenge for many users, exactly the kind of user that we want to bring into the picture. And those online systems will no doubt develop the capabilities for the analytic capabilities that desktop GIS has, but not yet necessarily. There's one of the things you asked, the second question I think was important CyberGIS related communities. And I think that, there's this non-GIS IT community and quantitative social science community, which has yet to be fully convinced that the spatialization of their data leads to significant findings. There's that big community of users who don't have GIS training, who expect that a software program online should be like opening the refrigerator door. You don't need to think, you just do it, right? And certainly GIS is not an area where GIS is like driving an 18-wheeler. You got to actually train to do it. Critical research questions. Well, I've already mentioned space-time integration, but one of the questions that's come up during the day from this morning's talk, from Buddha's talk was, again, it was asked of Lynn, was what are we doing to preserve data and make it accessible? And, my view of this as an historian is today's data is tomorrow's history. And I've seen lots of operations where, particularly in local government, where there's no effort to version data sets, where what they do is update the data and historical past data is lost. So that one of the great advantages we've had for longitudinal analysis is that we've had old maps. We've had those fire insurance maps, for example, that help us really understand cities. Well, if cities simply see their job as updating a data set and not versioning, and versioning can be a real pain in the butt too, then we're going to lose that data. And some of the great advantages of GIS will be there, but our ability to do longitudinal analysis, which is, I think, still very important for any kind of prediction and any kind of understanding of how we got to be where we are in the situation, will be lost. So I would plea for that. The other is the spatially enabling unstructured contents. I wrote once an article about spatially enabling historiography. What is involved in doing that? And I won't recite that here, but we now have all these journal repositories. JSTOR is an example, but there are many other for-profit ones now. We have libraries where many of the books actually have digital versions as well. There's lots of unstructured content out there, and we need to think of ways in which we can marry gazetteer information, GIS information, to all this unstructured narrative content and enrich that in ways that those people who wrote those works never expected to. I think that's probably enough.
Thanks, Mr. Bob?
Yeah, thank you. It was in 1988 when the NSF funded the what was then called the NCGIA, the National Center for Geographic Information and Analysis. And that entity had a tremendous impact on the field of GIS in the incipient years when it was evolving. I think this is a very timely center in that at this moment in the evolution of GIS, this center, the CyberGIS Center, is going to be able to make that next lift, I think, in the development of theories and applications around GIS science and systems. So I think the potential impact is remarkable. In reading the CyberGIS Center definition, the phrase that I really like in there is spatial thinking, because that's an area that really needs to be emphasized, not only with this GIS Center, but in all of our fields. It's a weakness in that we haven't really defined, in many ways, what spatial thinking means. So we do have a set of questions, and I quickly want to go through some of the questions that were asked. One is dealing with the opportunities, and there's lots of directions we could go in terms of the opportunities here. One is in terms of democratizing GI science and spatial information. We've had a conversation around VGI already today, volunteer geographic information and citizen sensors. And what we're going to see is we're going to see a remarkable wealth of data flow into GISs from what might be considered non-conventional sources. And there's going to be a whole new set of techniques and methods that will be necessary, built around CyberGIS, to integrate those new forms of data, those very atomic level sources of data, with the other standardized sources of data that we've been working with for a long time. I think another one of the significant opportunities is around the area of cognitive science, computer science, psychology, brain imaging. Over the last decade, there's just been a tremendous amount of progress made in the understanding of the human brain. And part of that involves spatial cognition and how the brain processes spatial abilities. Well, I think this project, the CyberGIS Center project, has to incorporate in some ways those concepts from cognitive science and brain science in getting at the usability of what we're producing, especially around advanced visualization methods. The assumption is that we can build these visualization methods and they are intuitive to human beings, and I think in many ways they're very non-intuitive to human beings. The question around communities came up, and what are the logical cognate communities for CyberGIS? Well, certainly we have to look to the government, and I think Lynn had lots to say today about the strong relationship we'll need with the USGS and the National MAP, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Census Bureau. But one community in particular that I wanted to mention, which I think is important, and there's tremendous opportunity, is around public health and disease modeling. Over the next N years, that's going to become an enormous growth area as we try to predict the spread of infectious diseases. And this spreads over into the animal world as well. Our School of Veterinary Science has become very interested in spatial disease modeling. Well, you have massive amounts of data and very thorny problems around predicting the spread of disease. So there's a whole arena of applications that I think will be prime for CyberGIS. At the University of Minnesota, over the last few years, we finished a project on the spread of West Nile virus, where we were trying to bring together disparate data sets on the cases, on land use, land cover, on the sample data, on mosquitoes. And we couldn't even come close to the real-time modeling and analysis with very simple kinds of data that one would expect. So I think, again, that's one area that I think we need to look at. In terms of research questions, there's one that I'll mention there. There's been lots already said about this, and it's the one that Lynn brought up earlier today, data integration. I'm going to call it data fusion and scale independence or scale dependence. That happens to be an area that I've looked at for 35 years, and it's the whole idea of how do you take disparate data sets at different scales, different resolutions, and blend them together, accounting for the data quality and the accuracy for these. And so what I see is the possible advances in real-time generalization and scale matching that will be possible. The idea of taking, let's say for some kind of environmental assessments, scale 1, which is a terrain model, scale 2, geodemographic data, scale 3, land use data, scale 4, toxic release sites, and instantaneously bringing those together. when Lynn presented his work today and talked about the time it took to do the generalization, I thought he was going to say, well, this took 45 seconds on our computer, and in fact it took 2 hours, which leads me to believe there's still a lot of great work to be done there. In terms of advances, again, lots one could say here. I think one of the ones that I wanted to mention is the ability to contribute to our discussions around privacy, legal issues, access, misuse, ethics, what we call GIS in society. And in fact, as you have more data and more processing available, that really lessens the privacy we have. And Voodoo, I think, was talking about this earlier today, but there are, I think, tremendous societal implications that have to be considered. In terms of collaborations, I'll mention a couple here. One is the emerging field of what's called geodesign. Geodesign is a new field that's emerging, actually not so new, it's about 3 or 4 years now, that's a blending together of the fields of design, in many ways landscape architecture and architecture, with GIS to do predictive modeling. It's kind of a different way of thinking about design that will require very intensive computing and extremely rich data. So I think that's one that should be considered. Since my world at Minnesota now involves undergraduate education, I also wanted to mention collaborations around curricular issues. One of the new ways we're thinking about undergraduate education is what's called the T model, where the expectation is that students have a very broad kind of education at one level, and that would be the top of the T, and a very deep experience into a particular domain, the T model. In fact, I go to a summit in San Jose next week on the T model. Well, as we look at what we want our undergraduates to learn, the top of the T becomes the domain of GI science and perhaps social science, and the vertical piece becomes spatial modeling, CyberGIS. And so I think we have to rethink our models of undergraduate education based on this. Finally, in terms of collaborations, I think universities have to be much more creative about partnerships on campus. One of the things we've created at Minnesota, I think it's similar to what's going on here, is what's called Spatial, that's really bringing together the myriad researchers and educators in the field of GI science, computer scientists, geographers, geologists, biostatisticians, working together on common problems. Funded by our research office. So universities have to think of ways to build a big tent and bring people together. Finally, I'll just mention, again, getting back to education, the need for CyberGIS work in education to tie itself into the world of STEM. There's been a tremendous new emphasis placed on STEM education nationally, and I think the CyberGIS initiative can play into this refocus on STEM education. We're going to be shifting away from the sage on the stage model of teaching quickly, at least in the STEM area, moving to active learning and new pedagogical strategies. And I think CyberGIS could really be at the forefront of some of those new techniques. I think I'll phase out there and leave it at that.
Well, thanks, Bob. Well, thanks so much for all the panelists. I think this is a tremendous breadth and depth, deep dives and broad brush simultaneously, covering a lot of areas, and also cuts across both research and education. I thought that was quite remarkable briefings there. I would not take much time at all. I would be just opening this immediately to the audience and to the floor. Any quick reactions, questions you might have for any of the panelists? The forum here is meant to encourage dialogue, and please go ahead to walk to those two microphones, whichever is closer to you.
I appreciate this very thoughtful group. I wonder what your opinions might be with regards to this spatial thinking, and if we might be losing our ability to do that now that people are not reading maps from top down. They're looking at through their navigation devices and only seeing what's in front of them or further down the road. And I wonder if we see any sort of, with that loss, maybe from, liken it to the changes from analog clocks to digital clocks, to see if maybe some people get left behind, and if we're maybe setting some people up for disaster into the future with that loss of an overview understanding of things.
Can I say something about that? Because I wanted to echo what Rob was saying about the role of this in undergraduate education and in education generally. That one of the things we've tried to do is try to see how we can bring spatial analysis into general education in all sorts of ways. But there is actually a physicist at Harvard named John Huth who teaches a very popular course called Primitive Navigation, pre-maps, right? Getting people to giving students active learning assignments to go out and, this is north, so figure out see if you can follow true north by following the sun and things like this. I think, though, that, at the beginning of the Iraq War, there was a survey, I think National Geographic did a survey and found out that only, 20% of college students could locate Iraq on a map. So it's pretty dismal news. I actually think that the sorts of things we can do now with online GIS give students more of a sense of the importance and relevance of location and space and correlations between different. Giving them the notion that we can disaggregate spatial data and analyze the relationships between different kinds of data is already a big thing. So I'm less pessimistic than you are.
Just a few quick comments. If my oldest daughter is any evidence of the loss of spatial reasoning, I think I'm seeing a clear example of problems here with all the technologies we have. My sense is we don't know. The jury's out on that. And that's why I mentioned the idea of brain science and cognitive science and the work that's being done in actually imaging brains as they process maps, as they process other spatial information. And I think over time, one can document if there's been a diminution of that or not. I'm not sure one could say that right now.
Are there comments from the panelists or?
So my comment is, I think this is the, so when we have the GPS navigation, this is to improve the quality of life, right? It's like before we don't have digital clock, we have to do some logic to read the analog clock, right? So not necessarily people just lose interest or lose the geospatial science. Also from another education perspective, from my teaching, for example, I'm teaching this very specific geospatial course at 2 universities. One concern from students is that, okay, where's the job market, right? So I have this skill set, it's really cool, but how many companies will use my skill set? So this, becomes a big concern. Actually, it's not the case. The skill set, especially CyberGIS, supercomputing, this skill set is quite adaptable, right? Many employers desire this kind of skill set. It's not just mapping companies or USGS, these organizations, but really, I think this is something we want to show the kids that not only cool but also very useful skill set for them.
Can I take 2 minutes, Shaowen?
Oh, absolutely.
Since Bob mentioned his daughter, I have to mention my wife. Everywhere I go, I have to mention her, so she feels that I've done something very meaningful. There is a distinction between spatial thinking and spatial cognition. And thinking is very critical because you are realizing the significance of space in the decisions you are making. I'm intrigued with the cognition aspect of it because my wife always told me that she just couldn't read a map. And my first instruction was, if you can read English on a map, that means you have it right way oriented, like north is up, right? And I told her that you can have this, for our anniversary, this magic gadget that if she puts it in the car, it will tell her where to go and all that stuff, right? And she got very excited. And the first thing she said, that's amazing, because now I can stop at the nearest gas station to ask for directions. Right? I didn't laugh, because you know what? There's a very, in navigation, the spatial, there's a strong aspect of how you think of space. So when I first arrived as a graduate student and I would ask anybody for directions, they would tell me that, how many blocks I have to walk north and then I have to go east, right? And I came from a world where directions only existed in front and back and left and right. So I was praying that the sun be out so I know which way is north. So it is a real challenge to get that cognition part in there. And I think part of this evolution in technology that we are seeing is actually helping a large section of the population, which my wife claims majority, in making decisions and optimizing on their actions very effectively, which is not a bad thing for us.
Thanks. Maybe it's a time to switch gear for a new question. Anyone?
I think I'll follow up a little bit on that. You had made a comment about wanting to make geospatial science kind of thinking, I think, as elegant as navigation software, alluding to that. And that raises a whole bunch of issues because we're talking about complex science issues and being brought to a level of understanding that's more intuitive. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that more, because it's obviously that incorporates a bunch of important topics and issues. And I wasn't sure which ones you were focused on or seeing as maybe fundamental to start with that kind of a problem.
That's an excellent question, and we struggle. I do not know what the first one is. So I made this claim during my presentation that the future society will have our energy, environment, and mobility interest simultaneously optimized. I don't think anybody knows which one do you start with, but everybody kind of agrees, and this is from general understanding of science, is that once you achieve one, the others are going to fall in place. That's the general. We do not know how true is that. The interesting opportunity that we have in this kind of really bringing the scalability in analysis, both in terms of understanding or integrating the complexity of it. Right now, so we live much closer to the practicing world, right? And all this progress that we are claiming we are making is actually not quite progress as a whole. What essentially we are doing is we are making progress along one infrastructure and shifting that burden to somebody else and not talking about it. So intelligent transportation is one example I'll take. We can put a whole lot of sensors. We know that an instrument our roadways and make cars talk to each other and then get it very well optimized. And we can clearly show whether it's through modeling and simulation or through experiments, field experiments, that it is actually working. But in reality, what we are doing is we are creating an enormous burden on the communication infrastructure. Okay? So if you ask the communications guys, they said, screw those transportation people. Do you know what they have done to us? Right? So this measuring, understanding these upstream and downstream consequences is very, very important and very, very key. Both in terms of, the other example I gave, that you have to understand, what. So I can go to the local planning people and ask them this question about if they understood beyond how it's going to, increase the activity in the local economy. They would say no. But they don't have any way. They don't have the ways to understand the consequence of their actions. And I'm not talking, a city like Champaign. It's the same in a city like Knoxville, which is a mid-sized American city. And I've worked closely with them, and neither the mayor nor the sustainability manager has any tool or resource to make those kind of understanding. They are basically just doing it because they feel that that's the right thing to do.
In the interest of time, I was thinking about one question right after Bob was concluding your remark. You mentioned the National Center for Geographic Information and Analysis program, NSF funded. Now it's 30 years ago almost. So that was something predated the Science Technology Center program. NSF had, 10 million investment at that time was very substantial. You mentioned moving forward, we see an opportunity of similar scale of community-driven framework to pursue the science technology challenges and opportunities we discussed here. So my question for the panelists is, in the new world of big data, collaborative science, what kind of forms and shapes you might be envisioning for our community to pursue perhaps a new broad center program that would have roots, across the country and beneficial to a new wave of science and technology. Started with you, Bob, since you brought up that point.
Shaowen, I wonder if you can just refine that question a bit for me, and
well,
give it to me. And I follow your whole thought process there, but I wonder if you can give me the question in 10 or 15 words.
Okay, yeah. So
I'm an administrator. It takes me time to
process.
Yeah.
Well, several of you were actually part of that process and history, right? Running the NCGIA and either being the evaluation part or being the participants or competitors. And it's been almost 3 decades after the initiation of that program. And as you alluded to, the science and technology part of our work has changed very substantially. And over this period, I would say NSF has not, as an agency, put a very systematic thought into what's the next big thing, right? So my question is, as we're thinking from a campus point of view, invited all of you as external experts. So what are the likely forms, organizations, because the technologies are different, the way we organize ourselves to pursue big science and problems are different. So just perhaps to be imaginative as to what might be something big we could hold a community together to pursue something really exciting. As you said, move to the next level.
Okay. I guess that was 15 words. So I guess and maybe I don't have a very, very good answer here that I'm going to spew off the top of my head in 5 seconds, but I will point back to the Spatial effort at Minnesota, because the Spatial effort is really built around bringing a disparate but related community together that hasn't been able to work together in many ways because of geography and the size of the campus and the fact we're split up among 3 different campuses. And what it's done through some modest funding is enabled a set of both research and curricular programs to be built that really forces the interaction and brings together not only the GIS researchers, and I mean that broadly, including computer scientists and biostatisticians, but brings together meteorologists and demographers. Our Minnesota Population Center is heavily involved in this, and the related disciplines around that, which is now further exciting the sense of what can be accomplished through these technologies. Mm-hmm. So that's one infrastructure that at a local level, Minnesota is working very well. Mm-hmm. That I think can be replicated across the country and will play a role in CyberGIS-like activities.
Mm-hmm. Peter?
Yeah, well, it's hard to answer your question.
It's open-ended question.
It is very open question. So Harvard entered into an agreement with Santa Barbara and George Mason to create one of these industry university research centers, in this case on spatio-temporal innovation. And it seems to me that one thing that we just might think of is that all sorts of different centers everywhere ought to be doing this sort of thing, making alliances, talking to each other. There are not that many big GIS centers in the country, right? It's not as if they couldn't all talk to each other. So, you know, I'm a believer in multinodal networks.
Thanks for coming over. Other comments? Doesn't have to be any order. No? Okay. Oh, well, I think we're a little over budget here. I would want to say once again, thanks so much for the panelists sharing their insights. Give them another applause.